I don't see how people who study history and really get into it for their whole lives can't see how unbelievably warped and wrong the mainstream position is when it comes to their chronology. You know, the evidence for this warping, for this inconsistency is everywhere. It doesn't matter what area of history you study, you know, relative to ancient or, you know, medieval kind of stuff. You look at these things, and the more you dig into it, the more you find that we don't have a really good understanding of what really happened back in the day. I mean, there's just nothing there. We don't have the scientific evidence. We don't have the physical proof. And we certainly do not have reliable historical sources, right? We just don't have them. To make matters worse, when you start to look at all of these sources, when you start to put together or try to put together some kind of a picture that makes any kind of sense, right, you just run into way too many problems. And at the very least, you have to admit that there are extraordinary gaps in the various histories that do not allow for any kind of a truly coherent picture to be published. I mean, the way mainstream looks at history is insane. These people literally believe they have it all figured out, right? And you go and you look at how what material they're working with. It's a joke. It's a literal joke. You couldn't get away with this in other, well, I guess you could nowadays, because nowadays everything is corrupt. But the reality is, if you apply the very basic scientific method to how historians have pieced together a mainstream narrative, it's absolutely hilariously bad. Like, it's just bad. The current version of world history is a joke, right? And that's just the reality. What I want to talk about today, or what I want to continue to discuss today, is a portion of history that is being erased right in front of our eyes. And this erasure has been going on for centuries. This is not a new phenomenon. This erasure has been happening by certain powers, or perpetrated by certain power structures, now for centuries. And for a very simple reason, right? They just want to gain more power. That's it. You don't need anything. You don't need a crazy conspiracy. You don't need anything weird. All you need to know is that there are people on this planet who have gone to great lengths to obtain power, and they want to maintain it and grow it. That's all you need, right? There's nothing weird about that. So one of the victims of this power grab has been Welsh history. Now, by extension, because Welsh history is essentially being erased by the royal Anglo-Saxon bloodline that has essentially corrupted everything over there in Europe. This is what has happened. Now, I'm not going to get into that whole side of history, because that is its own 8 trillion shows in and of itself, but it directly relates to the problem, or to the very interesting history that we are going to discuss today. And that history is this, right? Around 1,000 years ago, it looks like the Welsh actually made it over to North America and ended up colonizing a good chunk of the middle of it. And this is what real history and real archaeology has shown us. Now, of course, most people aren't aware of this for the simple fact that there is indeed a power structure trying to erase all of this. Like, it's hilarious to watch mainstream historians try to ignore all of the evidence that supports the Welsh showing up in America around 1,000 years ago. You know, this is one of those topics to where, if you really want to have a good time, you can go and you can read all the coping mechanisms that mainstream historians will try to use to explain away all of the copious amounts of evidence that support a Welsh existence in North America. I mean, they have everything from saying, so there's Welsh writing all over the place, for example, carved in stone, right? Straight up Cymru, it's there, it's right there, you can translate it, it says things. But what happens is that, like, historians and geologists and archaeologists will say, no, that's just natural scratching into the stone of nature. Or that's just a fossilized fish backbone. Like it's the dumbest thing you can imagine. I mean, this is why I hate geologists, like mainstream geologists. They will look at an obviously carved out sentence on a stone, and there are geologists who will say that that is a petrified fish backbone. It's the most insane thing you can imagine. Okay, anyway, but this is the level of cope that the mainstream goes to try and push out the notion that the Welsh ended up over here. What I want to do today is I want to go over a lot of the basic information that has been discovered relative to the Welsh's existence in North America, because I want to set the stage for future shows so we can start really analyzing this entire situation in the context of real history. The reason why this is going to be important is because, on this channel, we talk about catastrophism all the time, and, we should find evidence of catastrophism in all cultures all over the planet during certain specific periods of time if these catastrophes are real. And this the Welsh showing up in North America, interestingly enough, correlates perfectly with that. Now, for most historians, that's not why they are trying to push aside this aspect of North American history. The reality is most historians nowadays have been pre-programmed to essentially hate on European history in general and blindly believe whatever the mainstream currently believes. Or push whatever the mainstream currently pushes. That's all historians are nowadays. Right? Historians in the modern day and age, they don't make discoveries. They do not change the historical narrative if other discoveries are made, right? Nothing ever changes now. So it's funny that, anyway, historians are just propagandists. Let's just be honest. In the modern age, a mainstream historian is nothing more than a propagandist. And they don't know that, right? They've been programmed at a very certain level to think that they are doing good, to think that they are, pushing the correct narrative for the greater good of all humankind and blah, blah, blah. But of course they're not. Obviously they're not. They have no interest in real science. They have no interest in real history, because if they did, all of this stuff would have been changing constantly based on all of the new evidence that has been discovered over the past few centuries alone. Right? It's very, it's exhausting to, okay. All right. I know. I'm just babbling. Okay. So to get into this, what I want to do is I want to lay out today a lot of the very basics of what has been discovered relative to this whole situation, so that we have a general foundation as we move forward through a series of these talks, because there is a lot going on here. In fact, if we can gain a good understanding of what happened here in North America relative to this time frame alone, that will actually open up a lot of new doors for us to understand world history in general. So for example, right, this topic has the potential, and does, in my opinion, that's not an opinion, it's a scientific fact, but we'll go slow. This explains why we find the kinds of tribes that we do on North America when the Europeans show up in like the 1400s and 1500s. This has the potential to explain the genetic evidence that we find. This has the potential to explain all of the archaeological evidence that we find in North America that has nothing to do with the general concept of a North American Indian. This also has the potential to explain why humans are in the state that they are currently in during this period of time. And what I mean by that is, why are they only currently in the technological state that they exist in when this stuff is going on, instead of further along or further back? Right? And ultimately, it has the potential to explain things like, well, in all honesty, it has the potential to explain religions like Islam, Christianity, Catholicism, paganism, stuff like that. Right? This it's not a cornerstone. I don't want to say it's a cornerstone, but it's a foundational stone to basically all of modern history. Right? It's this is one of those things that also helps explain the zero event as well. Right? This period of history is insane. Like it's unbelievable. For those of you who are into Tartaria, for example, you actually are going to find a connection here with that. And this might actually help explain some of the migration, some of the events that took place, and then some of the other events that will take place afterwards that stuff like this will start the chain reaction of. Yeah, it's that crazy. It's that worldwide. Now, I've been saying that the Welsh show up around 1,000 years ago. For a lot of you out there, you might be thinking, is that quite right? What are you talking about? All right, so let's break down the basics of what happened here, and we'll go over some of the chronology, because the reason why I'm saying 1,000 years is because I'm using real chronology. Like, real chronology puts the Welsh arriving here, probably less than 1,000 years ago, a little less. But I'm just going to say 1,000 years because I don't have an exact date, right? I don't. So there's that in chronology, it is very difficult to get an exact date for anything, especially the further back we go. This is no exception. However, because this event takes place either during or directly after the zero event, we can actually place it around 1,000 years ago, not further back. Now, I've already broke down the very basics in an intro show to this show, basically, that went over kind of what happened in a very general way, and I think I just also blabbed a lot in there as well. And this show will probably be no different, but, I don't have time to edit all this crap out, and I'm not going to, because I don't care. I do not care. I do not have time. My life, life is just obnoxious. So, okay. But in that intro show, what we went over is the Welsh showing up, and more importantly, the Welsh are led by a guy named Prince Madoc. So if you really want to get into some of this stuff, go look up Prince Madoc and start there. And I'm going to give you a lot of information here that you can build off of and directions that you can go and look. And it's really important that you go and check this stuff out, because I'm not an expert on this, and there's still a ton of discoveries that have to be made. We still have holes. You could be the person that fills that hole, all right? So if you go right now and you look up Prince Madoc, one of the things you're going to find is the first thing you are going to find is you are going to find the mainstream perspective on Prince Madoc and the Welsh. And of course, the mainstream perspective is the Welsh never made it over here. Prince Madoc didn't do any of the stuff that it's claimed happened, and all the evidence that we have that's physical and historical is simply forgeries or wrong or made up or whatever, right? You're going to get all that cope. So I'm not saying completely ignore the mainstream, but when it comes to this situation, you can pretty much throw away anything in the mainstream, because these people don't care. Remember, they're not interested in the truth, right? They don't want the Welsh to be in North America. They're not allowed to have it. They can't do that. They can't support it, and they don't. So all they're going to say is, no, all the evidence that you have is simply wrong for whatever magical reason, and we say so because we have degrees, and that's it. So that's the mainstream perspective. So you got to sort through that crap. But to get you going on good research, and I mean on real good research, go look up two scholars that have really dug into this, named Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett. Now, these two researchers went crazy on this topic, and they did it the correct way. They followed the written history, they went and found archaeological evidence, they used science, and they came to their conclusions only by using those methodologies. All right, and I'm not going to get too much into them because there's a ton there. But this is where I would start if I were you, if you are not familiar with this situation. Now, those two researchers, they end up focusing more on the European side, though they do get into the American side as well. Don't get me wrong. But for the American side, there is a Kentucky Historical Institute, I believe that's their name, it's something like that really started the charge forward into this whole Prince Madoc Welsh situation. And they do other North American history stuff as well. But they're like one of the, if I believe they're probably the number one study area in this realm that really is correlating all of this evidence, all of this historical and scientific evidence to support the fact that the Welsh made it over here around 1,000 years ago. Now, let's get into the dating methodology first, because this is one of the first things you guys are going to run into. Now, like I said, I'm using 1,000 years because 1,000 years-ish, probably less, probably 800, 900 years ago. That's real chronology. Right, that gets rid of garbage like the Dark Ages. That gets rid of, multiple Roman empires. That gets rid of dumb things like, whatever was going on in supposed ancient Greece. That never existed. Right, it gets rid of all this garbage that was implanted into the mainstream historical narrative to fill gaps created by all the forgeries that the power structures were creating so that they could claim rulership over the populations. Right? It's literally that simple. Like, if you believe in a dark age, you also must believe in fairies and aliens and ghosts and yeah, if you're an atheist and you believe, it's funny, if you're an atheist and you believe in the Dark Ages, you are literally a religious zealot. I mean, it's that simple. Like, you think Christians are crazy? No. You're crazy. You're insane. Right? The Dark Ages never happened. Dumbest thing on the planet. Okay, I know. That's just one of those hot buttons that just, holy crap. Okay. And I'm not talking garbage about anybody. I know I'll be nice. I'm not saying that, but I don't know how to get it through to people that there's no such thing as Dark Ages. Like, it's just, okay, all right. So anyway, you get rid of all the garbage, right? You get rid of all the unsubstantiated claims, and you do real chronology, and real chronology shows that these events with the Welsh took place a little less than 1,000 years ago. Okay. But when you go and you start doing the studying, you are inevitably going to run into Alan Wilson and all of those guys, and they still end up using mainstream chronology. But in their defense, especially Alan Wilson, and he says this, so I as far as I know, I'm not mischaracterizing him. He even says that the Dark Ages never happened. Right? But standard stuff, he still falls into the mainstream chronology. So far as I'm aware, he doesn't really redate anything drastically. Even though the way he looks at things would require that he would redate certain aspects of this story drastically. And maybe some of that changed. Like I said, I've read tons of stuff, but I haven't read every little thing that they did. So, maybe they changed their minds at some point. But when you dive into the Alan Wilson side, you are going to find him dating the events, but the events are very much going to still be based on a mainstream chronology. All right, so that's kind of the weird cognitive dissonance that you'll get into when you start looking at the really good research. You'll find that they acknowledge that there are issues with the chronology, but they don't really factor them in. And the reason why is simple, right? It's psychological. They're afflicted by the same stuff everybody else is, right? We have all been trained that we've all been trained in the mainstream chronology. It's very difficult to relinquish that because you have the majority, the consensus, they believe in this. So it's, for a lot of people, it's very, very difficult to go against consensus. So, don't be a little bitch. Just go against consensus, right? If they don't have the evidence, tell them to f*** off. You can do that, right? You can just tell these people to f*** off. You can look at them and be like, dude, f*** off. You can just tell them right there while you grab them by their throats, smashing their heads into a toilet, and just tell them to f*** off. Alan Wilson's timeline will go something like this. So, in AD 562, there is a comet catastrophe. So right off the bat with this story, we're already entering the realm of catastrophism. And this is extremely important. This is not some religious weirdness. This is not some made-up garbage legend. The catastrophe is essentially required for these events to take place. Right? This is what's important in catastrophism, by the way. So if any of us are ever going to claim that some kind of a catastrophe did something to this planet, that means that history would had to have been directly affected. The events of history don't get to ignore like a sinking continent, for example. If you're going to tell me Atlantis sinks, then you better have a ton of other stuff happening on planet Earth, right? You have to. There's no way around it. Right, so same thing here. Right off the bat, Alan Wilson will also make the claim. Well, it's not even Alan Wilson. Okay, let me make sure that everybody understands this. Alan Wilson, as far as I'm aware, does not put forth a theory. He doesn't theorize things. He's not guessing at things. He is literally just following the written history and the physical archaeological evidence. That's extremely important to remember while we go over this. This is not his pet theory that he wants you to believe so that he can sell books, right? He doesn't do that. Okay, anyway. So in AD 562, a comet will devastate Britain. Right? A comet will enter the Earth's atmosphere, and debris from this comet will essentially wipe out all of Britain. Right? And this is, for example, when Gregory of Tours is writing about his 2 islands on fire from end to end. Right? This is what he's writing about. And I agree. This seems to be exactly what happened to some degree or another. A comet comes down and just absolutely destroys Britain. And of course, the first question we can ask is, did it hit Britain or did it simply fly over? And by all accounts, and I believe even Alan Wilson ended up being on board with, it was just debris. I personally have never found any evidence of an impact, of a cometary impact up there in Britain. And it doesn't look like that exists. So it seems like what happened is that the comet went over the British Isles. And when it went over that, all of that flaming debris just came raining down all over the British Isles and just absolutely wiped out that entire area. Now, what's interesting about this aspect of the catastrophe is that other histories corroborate this as well. Right? This is, if you want to have some fun, actually, before this comet hits Britain, there was actually, or the British Isles, there was actually a problem with people being unable to colonize the islands because there was another kind of people who lived on the British Isles, and they were a very difficult people to push out. And even funnier, these people, quote unquote, are called giants. So when the Welsh would try to come over and get a foothold in the British Isles, they would be pushed out. Not by just another kind of, tribal people, or another kind of Welsh or Anglo-Saxon. No. It was literally a different race of people who they call giants. Right? I know, it's crazy, but it's there. That's the history. These are the kinds of connections that we can make, that you can see. Anyway, so they weren't able to take the British Isles. This comet comes, flies over the islands, absolutely just burns the crap out of everything. I mean, it just lays waste to the entire area. Not only does it light the British Isles on fire, not only does it just absolutely go scorched earth, but the fallout from the comet will also make the island uninhabitable for around a decade. Right? There will be a huge amount of pestilence that will come in the wake of this comet. Now, of course, when we look at history, all throughout history, whenever we're dealing with any kind of a cometary body or fire raining down from the sky, we always find pestilence raining down as well. This is a very common theme, and it happens everywhere all the time throughout history. Right? This really does, in my opinion, it really shows you how devastating certain cosmological bodies could be to humans. Right? Is it possible that some of these bodies literally just have all kinds of... I don't want to say... is it possible that these diseases are in the comets themselves? And that's not quite accurate, because diseases have been shown... You know what? Okay, so check this out. I know, side note. So it's been shown that disease comes from your body being electrically out of whack. I guess I'll just say it like that. Because there have been many accounts that you can actually cure diseases by going through and bringing your body's electrical potential back to a normal area. But the reason why we have diseases the way we have them is because our body's electrochemical situation is out of whack. And once that happens... right, you get all the problems that would come with an electrical system being out of whack, and it shows up in the form of diseases. And then cometary bodies are an electrical body. So if you have an electrical body flying over, is it possible that it changes the electrical potential of the area, which would then throw the human body out of whack, which would then cause the disease, which means that, oh, well, yeah, something to think about. Okay, anyway, so the British Isles get wiped out, all right? They're gone. Now, while this event is taking place, Prince Madoc is at sea. All right, he's hanging out in the Atlantic Ocean when this comet flies over. When the comet flies over, it sounds like in the wake of that comet, the comet pulls that entire fleet across the Atlantic Ocean. And when it does that, that means that Madoc's fleet will inevitably hit North America. Now, what's interesting about this is the comet's trajectory. Now, the comet's reported trajectory, and this is in the sources, by the way, this is not, people making stuff up. This is what they say, came from a northeast direction and went southwest. So if you're hanging out in the Atlantic Ocean, if you're Prince Madoc, this comet flies over, it essentially grabs you, with all the wind and the water following it, and it pushes you across the Atlantic Ocean. It's going to push you in a very hard southwest direction. What that means is that you are going to miss the east coast of the United States. And this is exactly what happens. Because Madoc in 562 will not be blown over to the east coast of the United States, but is instead blown down around Florida, where the fleet will end up in the Gulf of Mexico. So they completely miss that side, and for whatever reason, this cometary body and the way that its trajectory and all the stuff that happens, it blows them into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when they're in the Gulf of Mexico, the fleet will eventually find Mobile Bay, and they will start to sail up the river systems from there. Now, Prince Madoc's fleet is apparently gone for 10 years, and they end up exploring America during this decade. Right? They're going to run into the North American Indian tribes. They are going to leave their mark during this 10 years. Now, obviously, it's just a small little fleet. This was not a huge, gargantuan, 10,000 ship fleet that got blown over. Right? It was just, I don't even know if there's numbers on the fleet, but it's like, 10 ships or something. It's not a huge deal. And if you're wondering, by the way, how the hell these ships survived the catastrophe, I agree with you on that question. That's a very interesting situation. How did the ships survive? Right? Could you imagine that? Being on some kind of a wooden ship that's obviously ocean-worthy, but having this burning comet just roar over the sky. And then in its wake, you would just see the waters and the wind come rushing at you. And it would grab your sails, it would grab your boats, and you just start getting pushed across the ocean at an incredible speed. Right? How did they survive that? It's a good question. I don't have an answer, but I've also never been in the tail or a wake of a comet that has entered the Earth's atmosphere. So it might be possible. I don't know. It's very interesting. Either way, so they're here for 10 years, they explore, and then they eventually decide to go back to Europe to tell everybody what happened. So in 572, they will sail back. The reason why we know they're gone for 10 years is because the records specifically state this. They even have dates on the records. Now, of course, the dates on these records are, well, that gets weird because of the dating methodologies used back then. And then, of course, a lot of this stuff was put through the ringer. Anyway, I don't want to get into that yet. Anyway, but the records state that Madoc and his fleet are gone for 10 years. And the records say that they are at sea for 10 years. Now, the reason why the records say that is because when these records were being written, they had no idea where Madoc went. Right? As far as they were concerned, they probably thought they were just gone. Right, that cometary catastrophe, I could easily see them saying, just thinking that they were wiped out. Like, that was it. But I personally haven't seen any record that specifically says that. The record just says that Madoc was at sea for 10 years. All right. So in 572, the fleet comes back, and the fleet returns, and everybody is shocked because they're like, what the hell? How are you alive? Right? You guys are in the middle of the ocean. This catastrophe took place. That was a decade ago, and here you guys are. Where the hell did you guys go? All right, and then Madoc is like, dude, we found this crazy other continent that is full of resources, that is essentially untouched. All right, remember, the reason why North America seems like it's untouched, and which it basically is because the Venus event had scoured it clean, only 500, 600, 700 years before. Right? There was not a lot of people in North America that survived that whole thing, and the rebuilding of all of that was not advanced. Let's put it like that. And of course, those people that end up doing the rebuilding would die out as well for some weird reason, or they leave. But that's a whole other story. Ignore that. We're going to focus on Madoc. Okay, anyway. So Madoc comes back to Europe, says, hey, look, there is this huge continent. It is full of resources. It is essentially untouched. We should sail over there. Why does he say that? Well, the main reason why he says that is because when they arrive back in the European area, Europe is decimated. Right? This area has been destroyed. It's not just the British Isles. Right? It's huge chunks of Europe. There were all kinds of earthquakes, burnings, meteors raining down from the sky, pestilence, disease. Right? This would account for one of the quote-unquote dark ages that they try to use, although they're not going to blame it on a comet. But this is what had happened. The area had been devastated. Right? This is why we find the ruins the way we find them, by the way. Right? It's very interesting. And of course, this is related to the Zero event. This is related to the character or thing known as Jesus as well, and that's going to be important later, but we'll get into that later as well. Anyway, so Madoc comes back, tells everybody there's a huge continent. Nobody believes him, right? They're like, what? Wait, what? Dude, come on, man. Like, what are you talking about? You probably just got blown down to some other, shoreline south or whatever, and shut up, dude. And Madoc is like, no, go check it out. Right? It's Admiral Gwennon that does not believe him. So this admiral, he's like, dude, no way. Madoc's like, yes way. Here's my star charts. The star chart thing is interesting because Madoc initially gives him these star charts that are not accurate. They no longer work. And this is one of the reasons why the admiral does not believe him. Because the star charts are different from what they should have been. And the reason why the star charts are now different is because the planet is now in a different orientation and the orbit has changed as well. Right? The comet, this cometary catastrophe is just a symptom of the main cause. Right? I won't get into that, but that's you got to remember that. That's going to be important. This is not just one random comet that comes out of nowhere, right? They knew stuff was coming, by the way. Like this was not a surprise. I'm sure they were surprised when it actually came, but I mean, they could see it in the sky. They knew stuff was going to happen. Anyway, that's not on topic. Okay. So, Madoc says, go sail over there. Go find out, dude. Don't listen to me. Use my charts. Go find out. So Admiral Gwennon is like, fine, whatever, douche. And then he gets onto his ship and he sails down and finds North America. Just like Madoc says. He finds it, turns around, comes back and says, yep, there is a continent there. The prince is right. And it is amazing. So everybody's like, well, let's get the hell out of here because right now Europe sucks. Europe is a desolated wasteland, more or less. It depends on the area that you live in, obviously, but where the areas they were, I mean, they had to get out. Right? It just wasn't in a good way. Stuff was already starting to recover, but the reality was it's going to take a while to really recover, so they need to move anyway. So North America sounds like a fantastic place to go. Now, if you're wondering why North America is untouched, remember, I said this comet, or whatever it was, it might not have been, I have no idea what it was. Whatever astrological or cosmological body creates this destruction, remember, it comes from the northeast and goes southwest. Essentially, the trajectory completely omits North America. North America does not suffer any direct attack from the comet because the comet doesn't fly over it. It doesn't do anything like that. It completely misses it. Right? The most North America would have had to deal with would have been sort of the fallout. There were probably tsunamis, nothing insane, not mountains of water, but there would have been some tsunamis for sure, some rough surf. You would have definitely had some messed up weather, absolutely. But the reality is, at this point in time, there's not a ton of people over there, right? You do not have huge coastal cities. There's nothing there, right? The North American continent is in a state of basic recovery. There's no one there. So nobody's affected. And the continent itself isn't affected anyways because the comet does not fly over it. It completely misses it. So that's important to remember. And that's another thing with catastrophism. You have to remember that there are going to be areas of the planet to where they're just not affected while other areas are going to be devastated. Right? Catastrophism gets weird because some catastrophes would necessarily affect the entire planet, even if it only happens on one side of the planet. And then there are other catastrophes that only will affect a certain area, even though they're pretty major, even though they're very destructive. The other parts of the world may not even know it happens. Right? So that's where things can get a little weird when we get into catastrophism. Okay, anyway. So North America is relatively pristine, and Europe is not. So they're like, screw this, let's get out of here. So in 575, a huge migration fleet is put together. You have Arthur II, Madoc, and you have Amandudu. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Anyway, they sail in a 700-ship fleet for America, with the sole purpose to basically restart their civilization. So they do. So they sail over to North America. They seem to go the exact same way that Madoc went, and by that I mean they completely skip the east coast of the United States, which is really fascinating if you think about that, right? Because if you're sailing from Europe, it's obviously easier to just head west or southwest-ish and just smash into the coast, right, to the east coast of the United States. But they don't seem to do that. For whatever reason, they really focus in on the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if that's because that's just the path Madoc ended up taking, and they just used that path. I could very easily see that, right? That's probably the explanation. But we really don't have any evidence that the Welsh hit the east coast directly. And that's important. That's important to remember. Because these guys will... Okay, well, anyway, so they sail over, right? They will enter the Gulf of Mexico, and they will eventually make their way to Mobile Bay. In Mobile Bay, that is basically where their expeditions will start. And so they'll start at the southern part of the United States and work their way up the river system. And as they do this, they will start to build their little civilization. Now, on the surface, this sounds insane, especially when you are using mainstream history as your backbone, right? Because you're not allowed to have white people show up in America any earlier than Columbus. Now, of course, if we listen to the actual histories of all the people who are living in North America and South America, right, all of them already talk about dealing with white people, either for good or bad. Right? Because that's what humans are. We have all kinds of interactions between people. We have interactions to where white people show up and they all start to work together. We have other areas where there are massive wars. Right? We have all sides of this, and this is what we would expect if this is what happened, right? Right? The Welsh, as far as I know, didn't come over in a hardcore conquering manner. That's not what they were doing. They were coming over looking for a place to settle down and live. And by all account, with Native Americans, that's what it sounds like it started out as, more or less, here and there. Now, not every tribe agreed with all of that, and of course, there's going to be conflict, and we'll get into that in a different show. But anyways, if you don't believe this, then the reality is North American Indians should have zero stories about white people during this period of time. They shouldn't exist. Right? There should be no genetic evidence. There should be no archaeological evidence. There should be no historical evidence. But we find the exact opposite. We find all of that existing in North America. And that's what it is. It's right there. You can go and read North American Indian legends, mythologies, etc. I really should just call them histories because that's what it is. Go read their histories. That's all you have to do. And the stories are right there. Their stories are right there. And those aren't the only stories that are there either, right? I mean, the North American Indians have some amazing histories, and the mainstream completely ignores all of them. They have to. Right? They have to ignore all of it. They initially tried to pick and choose here and there, but nowadays mainstream historians just say, nope, the North American Indians are noble savages. They don't understand science, so completely ignore all of their history because it's all crazy. Right? And that's how it goes. But if you pay attention to what they say, everything I just said is corroborated from their perspective. So we can't just write this off. The Welsh showing up, Prince Madoc showing up in North America is intrinsically part of North American history. Now it gets interesting, right? Because there's all kinds of things that will happen in North America. Right? We actually have some of the adventures that go down, and we can piece together other aspects of what went down relative to all of the archaeological evidence in the center area of North America. So it gets crazy because the archaeological evidence starts to line up with the written documented evidence, which will also line up with the histories of the North American Indians, which also line up with what the European settlers will run into when they start moving from east to west. It all lines up. It all works out. Now, there's a lot of details to go over, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff that happens. But what I wanted to do in this show was lay out the general foundation of what the story is and how they got over here. Now, in future shows, we will go over the catastrophe that blew them over here. We will talk about the relations between the North American Indians and the Welsh. We will go over how they spread out and how they disappear as well. We will go over things like potentially explaining the Michigan copper mines. Right? This story has the potential to really solve all kinds of historical problems that mainstream history has essentially written off, right? They don't pay attention to any of this. There's so many problems in North American history that it's hilarious. And they're such difficult problems that your average historian has no way to deal with them. So instead of dealing with them, they just either ignore them or call you a conspiracy theorist if you're trying to deal with them in a scientific manner. Like that's what we have to deal with. I mean, that's it. That happened. We've all dealt with that, I'm sure. All right, so that's the story of Prince Madoc. Now, the other aspect that we do need to deal with a little bit is the chronology of when these events took place. So right now, Alan Wilson has all of this stuff happening, in the middle of the 1st century, and he's still relying on mainstream chronology. Now, of course, what that means is that all of the events that I just talked about is essentially 1,500 years old. The problem with that is that the dates on a lot of the artifacts and the way the stratigraphy works and the way the stories of the events work out and the way that the records are recorded do not support a mainstream version of this kind of dating. It's just not there. So, for example, there's one other date that you will run into with respect to the Madoc history that I didn't go over in this show, and that's the date of 1170. All right, so there's 2 dates. The Alan Wilson date, the Alan Wilson information is fantastic because they went out of their way to try to just find the raw data. Their main mistake was still using mainstream chronology. The ironic part is, so they ignored the 1170 date. They decided that date was incorrect. As far as I'm aware, that's the way. They don't. Like I said, I gave you the dates they give you. They don't use 1170. But that 1170 date might actually have some merit, because don't forget, in chronology, in European chronology, when we see dates like 1170. More often than not, or all the time, I really should say, is that the date is not 1170, it is I I-170. Not 1170, but I-170. So what does that mean? Well, that means that Madoc's voyage did not take place in 1170. It took place in 170 AD. And that puts it roughly around 1,000 years ago, which lines up with all of the scientific and historical evidence that supports the cataclysm that would have driven this cometary body into Earth. See, it's crazy how all of this stuff just starts to line up when you don't focus on any preconceived notions. Right? It's all right there, and it all starts to fit together. Now, I'm not saying we have all the answers, because we don't. Right? One of the reasons I want to go over all of this is because we need more answers. Right? Basically, we need more information. And I guarantee you there's tons of really good information out there hidden in a lot of these smaller museums in the Midwest and up and down the Mississippi that we just don't know about. It's probably sitting right there, right? There's probably all kinds of crazy evidence that nobody really pays attention to because the general population thinks that the North American Indians created those artifacts, not the Welsh. So nobody pays attention to it, right? Because nobody cares about what a North American Indian created. Have you seen how historians treat these people? They don't care. They just think they're savages. It's hilarious. They just don't care. They're the worst races you can imagine, basically. Right? But if you start to look at those artifacts for what they are, right? If you were to re-examine some of that stuff, I guarantee you there's something out there. Unless the Smithsonian has gotten a hold of it, in which case that stuff is gone. Ugh. Yeah. All right. So that's a basic overview of Madoc relative to the dating system. So basically, American history is completely different than what we've been told, right? And of course, the Madoc tradition also goes a long way into explaining why we find a lot of the situations that the Europeans will find in the 14, 15, and 1600s over here as well, right? We have all kinds of reports that there are literally white tribes running around North America. Like, this is a fact. This happens. It's right there. Mainstream will say that, no, they're just mistaken, or whatever garbage mainstream tries to say. But that's what they find. That's what the settlers will discover. Right? So now we have an explanation, potentially, as to why that situation exists at all. Right? This Madoc tradition will start to explain real North American history. Not only from the people side, but also from the catastrophism side. Once we start to put all of this together, we can start to paint a different picture of not only North American history, but of world history as well.